The inaugural issue of the New Thinking Aloud magazine was just released on March 1st. You can download a free PDF copy from the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website. That's newthinkingaloud.org. You can even order a printed copy from nta-magazine.magcloud.com.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. We will be exploring possession today. My guest is Adam Crabtree, who is a trainer of psychotherapists at the Center for Training in Psychotherapy in Toronto, Canada. He is the author of many books, including Multiple Man, Explorations in Possession and Multiple Personality. Other titles include his most recent book, Evolutionary Love and the Ravages of Greed. Another book title is From Mesmer to Freud, Magnetic Sleep and the Roots of Psychological Healing. In addition, he is the co-author of a wonderful anthology called Irreducible Mind, and is the co-editor of another interesting anthology called Beyond Physicalism. Also, with reference to this interview, Adam was an ordained priest prior to becoming a psychotherapist. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. As an ordained priest, you were indoctrinated into the Catholic concepts of possession and exorcism.
Yes. When you're studying for ordination, you have to learn about those. Most priests never practice or never have the occasion to use exorcism, but you do need to know about it and be able to do it if it be required, I suppose.
That's a very rare circumstance.
Very rare circumstance, yes. I was a member of a Benedictine monastery, and only one person that I knew who ever did exorcisms in that monastery. So there was only one, and that's a very extraordinary thing that a person actually carries it out.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's fair to say, though, that in earlier centuries, in medieval times, for example, exorcism would have been the standard procedure for mental illness.
I think very often it was used in those cases where a person was acting strangely, not like themselves, and so the assumption is that they're possessed. Yes. It's a controversial thing today in the Catholic Church, a great hesitation to use these rites because sometimes they've been used to the detriment of people who are mentally ill. And so, rightly so, there's caution.
Today it's largely considered a form of ignorant superstition.
Generally, I would say, but in the church, there are still people who believe that this has a place.
Right. And in the wider society as well.
Yeah.
I hear from people all the time who accuse those of us engaged in parapsychology of doing the work of the devil.
Yes, right. That's true. That's true, yes.
So, as a psychotherapist, there is a need, I suppose, to make a distinction between intrapsychic processes that might be mistaken for possession and the possibility of autonomous psychic entities that literally do possess a human being.
Yes. I think that the psychotherapist has to take the attitude that, unless proven otherwise, it's probably a psychodynamic thing. That is, something that's produced by intrapsychic problems, conflicts, and manifesting in that particular form. I think that's the best assumption to make. But I think on the other hand, psychotherapists should always be open to facts or to experiences and not too quick to jump to conclusions that are explanatory before you really know for sure what you're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. And when you look at possession, which you regard as an authentic phenomenon, you notice that there are different kinds. For example, willing possession versus unwelcomed possession.
Yes, and historically, too, there have been a lot of, and today still, many people who practice possession. They want to be possessed in order to bring messages or to accomplish services for the community, that sort of thing.
Shamans.
That's right.
Trance mediums.
Yes, exactly. So it's still something that is operating in our society today. That is willing possession. Unwilling possession is a different matter. That's something that it might happen, I suppose, I don't know that much about other societies where that could occur, but in our society, unwilling possession would be considered something like if you are a believer in the devil, that you might be possessed by the devil. If you think there are demons, you might be possessed by demons, and those would ordinarily be considered unwilling possession.
But in many cases, it might simply be an intrapsychic process.
Yes.
A person can, I suppose, become possessed by their own thoughts.
Well, yes, that's right. They used to call them thought forms and sort of take a substantial form of their own and a life of their own. That's what the Theosophists call them.
Yeah.
But you can be possessed by your own thoughts just from a psychological point of view, and that's sort of the notion of obsession. Obsession is where a thought becomes something that's somewhat autonomous and takes its own actions.
Yeah. In some of the spiritual literature, there's the notion of the tulpa in Tibetan culture, where a person can generate a thought form so intensely that thought form can take a physical manifestation and kind of an autonomous existence.
That's right, yes. There have been things written about that. I have no direct experience of that sort of thing. My experience has been totally through my work as a psychotherapist. So there are other kinds of manifestations that I had no direct contact with.
Well, it's a big world out there.
Yes,
I guess.
Right.
Let's talk about some of your personal experiences with possession.
Yes.
As a therapist.
Right. Well, I first began becoming aware of possession, that people were experiencing something that looked like possession. Let me call it that, because I don't want to make any pronunciations of a general kind about this very difficult topic.
Yeah.
Working with people who were experiencing something that looked and felt to them like possession. My first contact with that was in the late 70s. And as a matter of fact, it's through that experience that I began wondering about the adequacy of some of our psychological and psychodynamic explanations for things, because I couldn't find a way to deal with some of these situations that seemed to make sense in terms of what they were actually experiencing. So I had to do a lot of research in the process of coming to terms with trying to help people who were experiencing, let me say, ostensible possession.
How did it manifest?
Well, it would typically, in my practice, manifested as an individual becoming aware of the presence within themselves of someone that they knew about. That is, it might have been an ancestor. That is, maybe a grandfather, grandmother. It might have been a dead brother. Some actual person who had been living and who had died and now seemed to be with them and seemed to be affecting their thoughts. And this was upsetting to them. There were some cases, also a few, where the person was still living and yet seemed to be with them and affecting them in a similar way.
Well, I certainly know that there are cases, in fact, the classic book in the early years of psychical research was called Phantasms of the Living, in which living individuals seem to manifest apparitions of themselves that would be seen sometimes by multiple persons in other distant locations.
Yes, that's right. Phantasms of the living. In one case of this kind, this individual that I was working with was dealing with her mother, who she felt was in her and affecting her, and she couldn't get rid of that. Now, you can certainly look at that psychodynamically and say this is a mother complex and so forth. That's a legitimate way to look at it.
But it might have been both.
It might have been both. The thing is that she did a lot of work with her mother complex, and it didn't have any effect on this. So she wanted to see if it could be explored as some actual presence of her mother. And we did. And her mother was still alive. Now, the interesting thing is that when she had a breakthrough and freed herself of this influence from her mother, who lived 500 miles away, showed a big change in her attitude and her communications with her daughter. Happened simultaneously with the end of that therapy, which is an interesting thing.
Yes, indeed.
It has maybe some bearing on how you might judge what was going on there. But that is the sort of thing that I've seen happen.
Well, I gather that as a psychotherapist, you've never seen anything akin to what might be called demonic possession.
No, the nearest to that was a man that I worked with. I talk about this in the book. The man that I worked with who felt himself possessed by this something or other that caused him to feel quite murderous towards his wife. And so this was a situation where he was quite afraid of himself in a certain way because of that. So we set up a project where I and a number of people that he knew, some strong men, went away to a kind of retreat house and worked with this thing. And it turned out to present itself, or to claim that it was a being that it had existed hundreds of years ago, and had come down through his family to him, ended up with him. And as we continued to examine this thing and listen to it talk and explain itself, it seemed to be something that was not human. It came from another kind of dimension or something like that, and had gotten lost and ended up on Earth and in this particular family tree. Now, it seemed really bizarre to me, but that was what was showing itself.
That was the narrative.
That was the narrative. And we worked with it that way. And eventually, in communicating with it through talking with this man, and this is always done in trance states, talking with the man and talking directly to it in that sense, it began to remember where it actually came from. Before that, it was like it had an amnesia for that. And when it did, it realized, because it tried to present itself as very evil and very bad, when it did, it became much more balanced, not just this evil thing. And it seemed to have a kind of conversion or change, and left. The outcome of the work that I have done with possession has always been to help the entity, person, whoever it is, to leave and go where they should be, rather than here, bothering this person.
Now, I know you're familiar with the work of William Baldwin, who developed what he called the spirit releasement therapy. Sometimes known as depossession therapy.
Yes. I am. What I did was very different from that, because first of all, he tended to see possession as demons of various kinds, of various powers and so forth. And his work was a kind of exorcism. And he was quite convinced of his view. And so when he did that work, the procedure was precisely to get rid of these things, sometimes in the hundreds or thousands from an individual. My work was never like that. It was always a very individual thing. There was a history there that had to be understood and a resolution that had to be met.
And now let's talk about some of the more willing forms of possession, because I think in order to understand possession, we have to look at the evidence for it in the annals of psychical research, where trance mediums manifest deceased persons, and often with a very clear statements that the medium herself or himself could not have known.
Yes, that's right. Those certainly, there are many instances of those kinds. Some of them are more convincing than others in terms of having evidential quality.
Yeah.
That is, it might convince you that, yes, this is that person.
Mm-hmm.
I think those, for me, that are really convincing are very few.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible to understand them a different way. Not
Mm-hmm.
saying that they aren't what they say, but they're not really necessarily evidential and convincing.
Well, I know there's a big controversy within parapsychology as to whether the medium is actually possessed by the spirit of a deceased person or whether the medium is using some form of extrasensory perception
Yes.
to gain that information.
Yes, yes, and Stephen Browday's work on this has been very important. I write a little bit about this in the book that I was the co-author of, Irreducible Mind, a very short segment in there where I talk about one possible understanding of what's happening is that the medium does take in a great deal of information, and they have an inner kind of malleability to form that into a personality.
Yeah.
And it would take a very special person to be able to do that and to make it convincing.
Now, I know William James wrote about this.
Yes.
The great American psychologist, and he described it, as I recall, as two wills: the will to personate of the medium or to incorporate that being, and then the external will of some entity, a spiritual entity, to be personated by the medium.
Yes.
So it requires kind of a partnership.
Yes, that's the way it seemed to be, that that both are willing and that the medium has some special ability to actually be receive communication about what needs to be passed on. I myself don't have a theory about that.
Yeah.
No.
Well, have you in your therapy practice addressed cases of deceased individuals?
Oh, yes. Most of them were deceased individuals, and most of those were relatives, related by blood in some way or other. And there was a history there to be understood. They were there not by accident, but for a reason. That not necessarily that they intended to be there within this individual affecting them, but there was a reason for it that maybe they found out in the process of our work together why they were there. They misunderstood a situation, and once they found out, they could leave. And so, as I mentioned, the idea was always to have enlightenment occur, some misunderstanding dealt with so that the person could leave.
Because I would think if I'm a deceased individual and I'm possessing a living relative for one reason or another, it might be to my benefit to move on.
Exactly. Well, that's what in virtually all the cases that I worked with, that is what happened. They didn't realize what they were doing. They didn't necessarily even realize they were taking possession or at least having some influence upon this individual. And once they realized that, they could come to see that they really should be elsewhere. And then they could discover where that elsewhere was and leave.
Now, all of this implies, if we're to take it literally, the existence of some sort of a realm. You could call it a realm of the subconscious, or you could call it a spiritual realm, and maybe there's an overlap there, but a realm in which the subconscious mind of human beings, such as ourselves, is actually interfacing with humans who no longer are in a physical body.
Yes, and I think that the psychology or the vision of Frederick Myers has a good framework for understanding it that way. He believed that mediums used the same channels for gathering and expressing their information that they used when expressing something that's intrapsychic to them. It's very same thing, so it's hard to judge which is which.
Yeah.
You have to find evidence that there's an outside source of information to prove that
That's
right,
case. Which is tricky.
Yeah, very tricky.
But the title of the book that you co-authored, Irreducible Mind,
Yes.
suggests by the very nature that you subscribe to the idea that there is a mental realm that cannot be reduced to physics or physiology or any form of materialism.
Yes, that's right. And I think that is the thing that got lost, that was being discovered, and sort of there was initial explorations occurring in the late 1800s, in the 1890s, with James, with Myers, and others. They were starting to explore this, and James said, "This is the problem that the 20th century should take up now." What Myers has opened up and the questions he's brought, and nothing was done in the 20th century. This is why we decided. Ed Kelly was had the idea, and he was the main author. We decided that exploration should be happening now. It was in advance for the 20th century, for a whole century, for various sociological and psychological reasons.
Well, psychology was in effect captured by the behaviorist movement.
That's right, and the cognitive side of things also took over, and it was quite a narrow view of the human psyche. So that's the idea of the book, is to say, okay, here's the problem we should take a look at now in the 21st century, because the subtitle of the book is It's Irreducible Mind, towards a psychology for the 21st century. Right. Missed the 20th. And so that's what we tried to do.
In other words, one might say that it's time for psychology and for society as general to take a second look at ideas that have been dismissed as pure superstition or animistic thinking that have no place in the modern world.
That's right. And one of the things that has to happen to do that is not to have preconceived notions of what is and is not possible based on an unconsciously held, rigidly held philosophy or metaphysics. This can't happen. Therefore, you can't see it if it is happening because you will be censoring what you're seeing. You will be giving it a form that's not just presenting itself to you. This is why I believe that we are at a time when the notion of phenomenology, where we let reality speak to us and try not to distort it in our perception of it, is so important.
And as a psychotherapist, I imagine that you are trained and train others to accept the narrative that is being presented to you without judging it.
I wish I could say that. I think that theoretically that would be said, everyone would say that. But in fact, when you start setting up psychological systems, you start forming ideas of what you're going to be looking for. And you miss other things, unfortunately. So I think it's the great struggle for the psychotherapist is not to do that, to really just let things present themselves to you without judgment, even though you say, how is that? Or that's weird. Without judgment, because then you can take in the whole of the evidence or the facts that are coming to you.
Well, and certainly many people have very strong opinions about these things.
Right, that's true.
There are certainly going to be people who, and I get comments from viewers occasionally who will watch an interview like this and post a comment saying, this is all BS.
Right.
Which is highly judgmental.
Well, it is. And, that person or whoever needs to say, why do you say that? Maybe you're right. But what is the reason? Is it just your assumption? Is this something you were taught? Is this something that seemed inevitable to you because of what other people said? Or is this something you've really looked into and really put aside prejudice to see what is and isn't possible in fact?
Well, once again, Adam Crabtree, a fascinating discussion of an issue that may be of much greater importance than people currently appreciate.
Well, I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you for being with me.
Glad to be here.
And thank you for being with us.